This is a show with no particular niche, baby. It's always about hanging out. Maybe we'll laugh at some stuff, maybe we'll learn something new, but it's always about hanging out, me and you. Hi, hello, and welcome to That Thing with James, a biweekly podcast about nothing in particular. I'm your host, James, and today we're talking about space travel, baby. Yeah, that's what's on the mind, and that's what's on the menu. But first, if you want access to the 90 plus bonus episodes of this show and the peace of mind that comes with supporting an independent creator, an independent artiste like yours truly, become a member today at patreon.com/thatthingwithjames. And to those of you who are already patrons, thank you. You rock. And for the rest, once again, 90 plus bonus episodes of this show full of laughter and joy and all sorts of stuff at patreon.com/thatthingwithjames. $5 is the minimum entry, and that gives you 30 days access to all of the bonus episodes. And there's different tiers with different perks available for you to access at patreon.com/thatthingwithjames. Feed an artist, support the show, and thank you to those who are already doing so. That was a very rough rhyme. There's that business. You can also find my show email, subreddit, and socials, those handles and addresses written in the episode description. And if you're watching this on YouTube, they should be appearing on the Chiron near the bottom of the screen. And for those of you not watching the show, if you didn't know, you can see my pretty visage, although my hair is a mess and I've not shaved yet today. You can find that at my YouTube channel. I think it's just like youtube.com/@TTWJ, or just go to youtube.com and search for That Thing with James, and my channel will pop up with this show and the other two web series that I made. One is done. The other I just haven't messed with for a long time because I've got so much stuff on my plate, so much that I can only do this podcast every other week without going insane. If I did it every single week, it wouldn't be any fun for anyone. So today we're getting into warp drives. And again, join Patreon if you're not already a member. If you want, patreon.com/thatthingwithjames. Warp drives. How do you do that thing you do is what I say when I watch Star Trek. Oh yeah, Star Trek. And they go into warp drive. They have warp coils. They have exotic elements that they use. They have nacelles, although I believe a nacelle is a standard part of any ship. However, or aircraft. I'm not really sure what the nacelle is, but I like the word nacelle. Nacelle. It sounds like it could be some sort of like medicated skin cream or something for stuffy nose. Nacelle. Nasal. Nasal? No, they can't be the same thing. I believe they're spelled rather differently. But still, warp drive. Wouldn't that be cool? Being able to travel great distances, and I mean close to incomprehensible for the average human being. Close to incomprehensibly far distances in a very short amount of time. How does it work? How do you get enough energy to do something like that? How do you get the person in the craft that's going so fast, like light speed, or perhaps even faster than light speed? Is that even possible? How do you do that? Go to such great velocities without your body turning into jelly? Do you create some sort of bubble around you while you move through space? Do you perhaps create so you could create like a force field where it's like pressurized in the cabin, like you're in an airplane. So your craft is going super fast, but you are not afflicted by crushing, obliterating force. Or do you somehow find a bubble, a super frictionless bubble that, gets between the fabric of space-time, sort of like a dot of oil in water. If you watch, oil can travel very fast across water because it's very low friction. If you can become the oil to the water that is the fabric of space-time, could you just sort of glide along? Could the pressure behind the displaced space-time fabric coming together behind you force you ahead? And then how do you stop? Or do you fold space-time itself and puncture a hole so that you're not traveling across all this place? You have point A and point B, and you bring those points together and travel through a little tube to get there. How can one travel really far, really fast, without breaking the laws of physics and or without turning into jelly? Well, we're going to look into that a little bit today, but first, let me find my bearing and take a sip of water, and we'll get into it. Okay, here's how I think I'm going to approach this. I mentioned wormholes, and that's the smaller topic compared to the larger topic I'm probing a little bit into in this episode. So let's start with wormholes, and then we'll get into the warp drive, how that works in Star Trek and the science around it. And then we will get into the actual warp drive that is being worked on right now. Now, granted, it's extremely, extremely early stages, but scientists are working on it. So first, let's look at wormholes. This is sourced from space.com. Let's see, updated March 5, 2024 by Nola Taylor Tillman and Alyssa Harvey, with contributions from Rebecca Sohn. What are wormholes? At space.com. Okay, so here we go. The wormhole theory postulates that a theoretical passage through space-time could create shortcuts for long journeys across the universe. Wormholes are predicted by the theory of general relativity, but be wary. Wormholes bring with them dangers of sudden collapse, high radiation, and dangerous contact with exotic matter. There's a wormhole in Deep Space Nine, by the way, but, there's some issues around that. Anyway, are wormholes theoretically possible? A wormhole is thought to be essentially a tunnel from one place in space to another. When you have a massive object in space-time, it basically creates a curvature of the space-time in the nearby region. That would be the effect of gravity. As you get more and more mass, we expect that the curvature becomes more extreme. We think such objects occur in the universe, and they are what we call a black hole, where light cannot escape due to this extreme curvature of space-time. We think what happens is, at some point, if the mass of an object becomes large enough, the other forces of nature besides gravity can't support the matter, and it becomes a black hole. You could think about this as one side of a wormhole. Could you have a situation in which the curvature is extreme enough to connect up with something analogous on the other side, somewhere else in space-time? Theoretically, that could be true. Has a wormhole ever been found? No. We have a substantial amount of evidence for the existence of black holes, but there's been no wormholes found. Are there different types of wormholes? There are different theoretical implementations of our theory of gravitation called general relativity that would describe wormholes with somewhat different properties. For instance, one of the big distinctions in the types of wormholes that are described are whether or not they are traversable. By that, I mean whether you can go from one end to another. So yes, in that sense, there could be different types of wormholes. And that's enough for wormholes. So that's basically how they work. Another way is that you somehow fold space-time and like you got a paper and you put a dot on one end and then a dot at the other, and then you fold the paper so the dots are sort of touching, and then you go through that. That's another way of sort of fabricating a wormhole, theoretically. Now, before we get into the actual warp drive that is being developed, let's first look at how it works in science fiction. This is from science.howstuffworks.com, titled How Warp Speed Works by John Fuller. And this is a longer article. I've not read through all of it. As usual, I just cobbled this stuff together right before I hit record. So let's jump into it and see what happens. On board the Starship Enterprise, you're hanging out with the crew members, enjoying a game of poker. You're traveling at impulse speed during a leisurely deep space exploration, and everyone has some downtime. But wait. All of a sudden, the ship receives an urgent message from the Federation Admiral informing the crew of an outbreak of war in the neutral zone. The Enterprise is ordered to report to the situation as soon as possible. The area in question is about 20 light years, that is 117 trillion kilometers, away. But this is no problem in the Star Trek universe. The captain adjusts the ship's warp drive appropriately, and you settle in for warp speed. Traveling faster than the speed of light, you should arrive at your destination in just a few minutes. And if you are a fan of Star Trek The Next Generation, you may notice that when they go into warp speed, the dots that are stars out in space begin to elongate. And then as they increase, those stars go from the color white to every color in the rainbow because they're going faster than the speed of light. So then they're basically seeing light traveling. They're seeing it broken down into separate wavelengths, which I think is a very cool detail. Onward. For as long as humans have looked up to the skies, space has fascinated us. And astronomers and philosophers alike have asked the most fundamental questions while staring at the stars. What are we doing here anyway? How did the universe begin? And are there other parallel universes that mirror ours? Is there life out there in other galaxies? And what would it be like to travel there? While we haven't quite answered these questions yet, we at least have science fiction like Star Trek to test the human imagination. Everything from H.G. Wells' The Time Machine to Star Trek to Joss Whedon's Firefly series, they've touched on the possibilities of time travel, teleportation, and of course warp speed. But how does something like warp speed fit into reality and our universe? Is warp speed just a wacky science fiction device, or is it theoretically possible? How does it work in the Star Trek universe? For everything on warp speed, infinity, and beyond, read the following pages. First, we look at Newton's third law of motion. When the writers of Star Trek sat down to plan the series, they found themselves confronted with a few problems. They were essentially creating a space opera, a subgenre of science fiction that takes place in space and covers the span of several galaxies and millions of light years. The Star Wars films are another example of the space opera subgenre. As the opera part of the name suggests, a show like Star Trek isn't meant to be slow or ordinary. When people think of the series, they probably think of melodramatic plots involving aliens, space travel, and action-packed laser fights. So, the creator of the series, Gene Roddenberry, and the other writers had to find a way to move the show's characters around the universe in a timely, dramatic fashion. At the same time, they wanted to do their best to stick to the laws of physics. The biggest problem was that even if a starship could travel at the speed of light, the time to go from one galaxy to another would still take hundreds, maybe thousands of years. A journey from the Earth to the center of our galaxy, for example, would take about 25,000 years if you were to travel just under the speed of light. This, of course, wouldn't make very exciting television. The invention of warp speed solved the opera part of the problem, since it allowed the Enterprise to go much faster than the speed of light. But what was the explanation? How could they explain an object traveling faster than the speed of light, something Einstein proved impossible in his special theory of relativity? The first obstacle the writers had to confront is much simpler than you'd think. One of the most important things you need to know before understanding warp speed is actually one of the oldest tricks in the physics book, Newton's third law of motion. You've probably heard it. This law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. It simply means that for every interaction between two objects, a pair of forces is working on both of them. For instance, if you roll one billiard ball straight into another one that's at rest, they will both exert an equal force on each other. The moving ball will hit the ball at rest and push it away, but it will also be pushed back by the latter. You feel this law come into play every time you accelerate in a car or fly in an airplane. As the vehicle speeds up and moves forward, you feel pressure on your seat. The seat is pushing on you, but you are also exerting a force against the seat. Turning into jelly if you go too fast. So, what does this have to do with Star Trek and the Enterprise? Even if it were possible to accelerate to something like half the speed of light, such an intense acceleration would kill a person by smashing him against his seat. Even though he'd be pushing back with equal force and equal and opposite force, his mass compared to the starship is just too small. The same kind of thing happens when a mosquito hits your windshield and splatters. So how can the Enterprise possibly go faster than the speed of light without killing the members on board? In the next section, we'll see how the Star Trek creators began to get around the problem of sending matter through space at superluminal speeds, light, Einstein relativity, and the space-time continuum. In order to sidestep the issue of Newton's third law of motion and the impossibility of matter traveling faster than the speed of light, we can look to Einstein and the relationship between space and time. Taken together, space consisting of three dimensions, up, down, left, right, forward, and backward, and time are all part of what's called space-time continuum. It's important to understand Einstein's work on the space-time continuum and how it relates to the Enterprise traveling through space. In his special theory of relativity, Einstein states two postulates. One, the speed of light, about 300 million meters per second, is the same for all observers whether or not they are moving. Two, anyone moving at a constant speed should observe the same physical laws. Putting these two ideas together, Einstein realized that space and time are relative. An object in motion can actually experience time at a slower rate than one at rest. Although this may seem absurd to us, we travel incredibly slow when compared to the speed of light. So we don't notice the hands on our watches ticking slower when we're running or traveling on an airplane. Scientists have actually proved this phenomena by sending atomic clocks up with high-speed rocket ships. They returned to Earth slightly behind the clocks on the ground. Yeah, they actually proved this. What does this mean for Captain Kirk and his team? The closer an object gets to the speed of light, that object actually experiences time at a significantly slower rate. If the Enterprise were traveling safely at close to the speed of light to the center of our galaxy from Earth, it would take 25,000 years of Earth time. For the crew, however, the trip would probably only take 10 years. Although that time frame might be possible for the individuals on board, we're presented with yet another problem. A Federation attempting to run an intergalactic civilization would run into some problems if it took 50,000 years for a starship to hit the center of our galaxy and come back. So, the Enterprise has to avoid the speed of light in order to keep the passengers on board in sync with Federation time. At the same time, it also must reach speeds faster than that of light in order to move around the universe in an efficient manner. Unfortunately, as Einstein states in his special theory of relativity, nothing is faster than the speed of light. Space travel, therefore, would be impossible if we're looking at the special relativity. That's why we need to look at Einstein's later theory, the general theory of relativity, which describes how gravity affects the shape of space and flow of time. Imagine a stretched out sheet. If you place a bowling ball in the middle of the sheet will warp as the weight of the ball pushes down on it. If you place a baseball on the same sheet, it will roll towards the bowling ball. This is a simple design, and space doesn't act like a two-dimension bed sheet, but it can be applied to something like our solar system. More massive objects like our sun can warp space and affect the orbits of the surrounding planets. The planets don't fall into the sun, of course, because of the high speeds at which they travel. On the next page, we'll see how this comes into play for the Enterprise. So, yeah, putting a bowling ball down on a stretched out sheet would be a two-dimensional example of how mass affects gravity and thus time. But you just apply that in 3 dimensions. So instead of just going up and down, it's all around. Everything around you is bent by the mass that is yo mama. I'm going to need another sip of water. Just a second. Onward. The warp drive. The ability to manipulate space is the most important concept in regard to warp speed. If the Enterprise could warp the space-time continuum by expanding the area behind it and contracting the area in front of it, the crew could avoid going the speed of light. As long as it creates its own gravitational field, the starship could travel locally at very slow velocities, therefore avoiding the pitfalls of Newton's third law of motion and keeping clocks in sync with its launch site and destination. The ship isn't really traveling at a quote-unquote speed per se. It's more like it's pulling its destination toward it while pushing its starting point back. Kind of like what I was talking about, displacing the water, like a drop of oil displacing the water around it. See, I'm pretty smart. Because the ideas of Einstein's general theory of relativity are complex and still open to interpretation, this leaves the possibilities wide open for science fiction writers. We may not know how to bend space and time with our current technology, but a fictionalized civilization set in the future may be completely capable of inventing such a device with the right imagination. In In the Star Trek universe, warp speed is accomplished through using a warp drive. The warp drive is powered by matter-antimatter reactions, which are regulated by a substance called dilithium. This reaction creates highly energetic plasma known as electroplasma, a type of matter with its own magnetic field, which reacts with the starship's warp coils. The warp coils are typically enclosed in what the Star Trek writers call a warp nacelle. And I looked up what a nacelle is. It's the thing that houses the engine on an airplane. So the cylindrical things hanging off the wings, those are nacelles. The whole package creates a warp field or warp bubble around the Enterprise, allowing the ship and its crew to remain safe while space manipulates around them. Sometime between the first television series and the second, The Next Generation, the writers decided to assign a limit to warp speed using a scale of warp 1 to warp 10. The Enterprise wasn't allowed to travel just anywhere at any time, seeing as that would make the plotting too easy. In the show, warp 10 can become an impossible maximum speed at an infinity in which the starship would be at all points in the universe at the same time. Warp 9.6, according to the Next Generation technical manual, is the highest attainable speed. It's set at 1,909 times the speed of light. Although there are some inconsistencies, the following list, we're not even going to get into it, but it breaks down the various warp levels and their speeds relative to that of light. Problems with warp speed. So, Einstein helped the Star Trek writers manipulate space in a science fictional universe, but is it actually possible to build a spaceship that could propel people across vast galaxies in a relatively short period of time? Physicist Miguel Alcubierre has suggested the use of so-called exotic matter, quote unquote, a theoretical type of matter with negative energy. If it could be found or created, the exotic matter would do the job of repelling space and time and creating the gravitational field. Unfortunately, that's as far as it goes for possible fuel sources. There are more problems than solutions when it comes to the concept of powering warp speed. Even if the Enterprise were to travel at sublight speeds, known as impulse drive to Star Trek fans, the amount of fuel and energy needed to travel quickly through space would be too much for a single starship. The impulse drive of the Enterprise is powered by nuclear fusion, the same kind of reaction that lights up the sun and creates huge explosions from certain nuclear bombs. According to Dr. Lawrence Krauss, a theoretical physicist and author of The Physics of Star Trek, if Captain Kirk wanted to travel at half the speed of light, that is 150,000 kilometers per second, the starship would need to burn 81 times its mass in hydrogen, the fuel used for nuclear fusion. The technical manual for Star Trek The Next Generation lists the Enterprise as more than 4 million metric tons in weight, so the ship would need more than 300 million metric tons of hydrogen just to move forward. Of course, to slow down and stop, the starship would need yet another 300 million metric tons of fuel, and a potential trip across galaxies would need 6,642 times the mass of the Enterprise. That's a lot of fuel. That's a lot. How do you solve that problem? Some people have proposed a system in which a device gathers hydrogen as the starship travels, foregoing the necessity to store huge amounts of fuel. But Krauss suggests this device would have to be about 25 miles wide to capture anything worth using. Even though hydrogen is the most abundant element in the galaxy, there's only about 1 atom of hydrogen for every cubic square inch. Making the warp drive would be another thing. The warp drive in Star Trek gets its power by reacting matter with antimatter. The result is complete annihilation and the release of pure energy. Since antimatter isn't very common throughout our universe, the Federation would have to produce it, something we can do today at the Fermi National Accelerator Labs, or Fermilab, in Illinois. Again, the problem turns out to be the issue of the amount of fuel necessary to power a warp drive. Krauss notes that Fermilab is capable of producing 5 billion antiprotons in 1 hour, enough to produce 1/1000th of a watt. You would need 100,000 Fermilabs to power a single light bulb. Producing enough antiprotons to bend the space-time continuum looks near impossible as far as our current technology goes. Although there's little chance during this century of humans developing a spaceship that could bend space and travel to distant galaxies faster than the speed of light, that hasn't stopped scientists and fans of the series alike to think about the potential. As recent as November 2007, the British Interplanetary Society brought together several physicists for a conference called Faster Than Light, Breaking the Interstellar Barrier. So that's that. Now, let's look at what's actually happening here at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. This article is at uah.edu. It was published May 29th, 2024 by Russ Nelson, title UAH Researcher Leads Groundbreaking Paper That Demonstrates for the First Time a Subluminal Warp Drive is Possible Through Known Physics. And it's got a picture of these dudes, and they are very dorky looking. Let's read, excuse me. 2 researchers at the University of Alabama in Huntsville have published a paper that demonstrates for the first time that a subluminal warp drive is possible within the bounds of known physics without the need to employ exotic, unknown forms of matter or energy, while also advancing our understanding of gravity. UAH, let's call it UAH. Alumnus Dr. Jared Fuchs led a team of physicists that produced a paper supported by Dr. Christopher Helmrich, also an alumnus of UAH, a part of the University of Alabama system, were both working in conjunction with the New York-based Applied Propulsion Laboratory of Applied Physics, or APL. We've got an Apple. No, I don't like that. It's too close to that shitty company. When Mexican physicist, here he is again, when Mexican physicist Miguel Alcubierre first proposed his theoretical warp drive in 1994, the concept required a bubble of, quote, negative energy density, unquote, around an object to create an imbalance in space-time, generating motion without the movement of the craft, thus avoiding violations of the speed of light limit. Hey, and now that we read about how Star Trek warp drive works, I feel like I did a good thing because I understand this now a little more gooder. But the Star Trek dream comes with a catch. It would have to be powered by either exotic particles that haven't yet been discovered, or the mysterious dark energy thought to drive the expansion of the universe, currently viewed by most physicists as not remotely achievable. Fuchs's team constant velocity subluminal warp drive, however, offers a new means of propulsion that allows it to operate at constant subluminal speeds while still conforming to Einstein's theory of general relativity, with no need for, quote, unphysical, unquote, forms of matter required by previous designs. Quote, prior models required a matter-energy content that was unphysical, meaning it had features we don't see in the regular universe, like negative energy, the researcher explains. Our approach was to avoid needing this exotic matter by adding positive energy to the solution while keeping as much of the warp drive effective as possible, unquote. When physicists talk about positive energy, they mean phenomena like light, matter, and antimatter, all naturally abundant in our universe. And the team also proposes something else that can be used to warp space-time: gravity. Quote, gravity in this context means a certain kind of curvature that occurs in space which affects things around it, Fuchs notes. One feature of regular matter is that it affects things far away from it in space-time, getting weaker to infinity. This is in contrast to most warp solutions, where the warp bubble doesn't affect things far away at all, only locally around the bubble. In many ways, it is this localness of most warp solutions that leads to its unphysical nature, unquote. I'm not quite sure I get that. I would need that broken down, but let's keep reading. Building a gateway to the stars. The first challenge is understanding what makes warp happen, the physicist reports. Quote, contrary to popular discussions, warp doesn't expand or contract space. Rather, it relies on large amounts of energy moving rapidly around the passenger volume, which creates a conveyor belt effect on the inside. This energy motion is like a smoke ring, but on the inside of this ring, it can transport passengers along via gravity. If you make this ring of matter move while you modify this conveyor effect, you will have a warp drive that transports passengers along space-time, as is shown in this animation, which I can't show you, and I'm not going to show you. So we'll just have to imagine it together because I haven't seen it either, which the team calls warp bubble momentum flux. And that sounds like an anime. The black line let's imagine there's a black line. The black line indicates the direction of the momentum flow in which the warp bubble, hold on. The black line indicates the direction of the momentum flow in the warp bubble, while the gray sphere is the passenger volume, which is an empty region on the inside. The white region shows higher density and the blue region shows lower density. The term subluminal means the bubble of regular matter would be moving at less than the speed of light, which indicates it's not going to solve the Star Trek-like future of rapid transport, Fuchs says. However, this concept still has the warp effect of accelerating passengers without any g-forces using regular matter, which is a unique feature that could lead to other kinds of interesting things. Our approach was to take the features we know that make positive energy and combine them with the features we know that make the warp happen. Together, this makes a bubble of rapidly moving matter, which is physical. Equations involving general relativity are famously difficult to solve, especially in complex cases like a warp drive. To help accelerate the process, the team developed software called Warp Factory to solve the equation and verify they conform to the required energy demands. Quote, we applied for a warp grant over a year ago and began working with the APL team to develop Warp Factory, Fuchs says. This eventually resulted in the tools we needed to discover the solution in the paper. The researcher adds that Warp Factory is a public codebase that anyone can use to recreate a solution or make their own. Also, it's sort of open source. That's cool. That's how knowledge expands, is when it's not fucking gatekept. Anyone can look into it and anyone can contribute. More brains, more better, right? Looking to the future to predict whether such a mode of transportation will ever become practical reality, Fuchs points out, it's hard to know what the time frame is, but there are many challenges to making warp drives possible. I think we have many years to understand what is possible. The thing with warp is that we are exploring the bounds of general relativity. Even if warp drive turns out to be impractical, our understanding could lead to new avenues we don't know yet. And that's the end of that article. And that's warp drive. What would you do with warp drive? And how do you think warp drive could be made now? Have you any knowledge? Write a comment on the YouTube section. Or email me, the show email, ThatThingWithJames@gmail.com. Or better yet, become a member at patreon.com/ThatThingWithJames, and you can comment on there while enjoying all 90 plus bonus episodes. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye.